Hey, you out in the hallway, come on in. You can talk later. My name's Robert Egger. And before we get started, I'd like to ask you to join me in at least thanking the people who grew, harvested, cooked, and served your food over the next few days while you're here in Los Angeles, California. I'd also like to give a shout out to the 100 women who began their journey to Washington, D.C. this week to begin the journey of true change that we need in America. Right on, sisters, right on. But I'd like to also, as historic as last week was, I'd very much like to point out to another woman who made history 146 years ago last week, and that was Susan B. Anthony, who got herself arrested for just trying to vote. It had been 24 years since the Seneca Falls Convention, a convention very similar to the nonprofit conferences we all go to, mostly women, mostly white women, with a couple of men and people of color holding on for dear life, hoping that maybe they'd get a chance at the table too. And not much had happened in those 24 years, so Susan decided it was time for some direct action. She went out and did what she knew had to be done, direct action. And last week, as they do every election year, women from around the country go to put their I voted sticker on her gravestone in Rochester, New York. Now, it took another full 48 years before the 19th Amendment was passed, finally giving women the right to vote. So to a certain extent, brothers and sisters, one of the things we have to think about is, as exciting as it was to see 100 daring, different, driven women elected last week, we have to ask ourselves, why did it take 100 years from the day women got the right to vote to when we finally elected 100 women? That should have happened in 1922, 1938. What took so long? As you all know, my name is Robert Egger, and many of you all know the business I came here to build in Los Angeles closed 2 weeks ago. Some of you are probably here because you want to hear my mea culpa. And the reality is, go buy me a tequila after this, I'll mea culpa all night long. But the reality is, I'm not here to talk about what happened to LA Kitchen as much as to talk about us as a sector. And what and how did the things that kept us from achieving our powerful mission, how do your programs face the same obstacles we face? And how do you avoid the trap that I lovingly fell into? Now, the reality is, I came here almost 6 years ago with a vision, saying, in fact, wow, man, you know, every single day in America, 10,000 people turn 70, and there's no plan. And we're going to have to feed those men and women better food for less money. What better place to try a bold new experiment, not just in senior nutrition, but let's really unpack the entire construct of aging in America. And what better town than Los Angeles, the city where the future comes to happen? It has an abundance of fresh fruits and vegetables that I could use to not just train unemployed men and women for jobs, men and women coming out of foster care or home for prison. Not only can we use it to engage thousands of volunteers, whether it's any of the 750,000 kids who have to get service hours, or any of the 1.25 million and soon to be 2.2 million people over 65, that we as a country must keep engaged. And how could they produce beautiful, healthy meals out of the nonprofit side of the organization? But more importantly, how could we take an existing city contract to provide city meals and through the powerful lens of social enterprise show how a city contract, one contract, could get 2-for-1 meals? Liberation, fewer people in prison, fewer people on the street, more old and young intergenerationally brought together. All the things we tried to do, I wasn't able to accomplish, as hard as I try, and as bold as our accomplishments were. And the reality is, what I ran into is what many of us run into every single day: the fierce grip of normal, the tyranny of routine. The reality is, I was stopped, and I could go on, but it's very simple just to say I was stopped by the 4-compartment plate. Because what I wanted to do is really explore a brand new way to nourish seniors. But what I was told by the Department of Aging, the very group I wanted to contract with and I had hoped to partner with, to make LA the city where people came from around the world to see how we not just nourish our elders, but engage our elders. And more importantly, sisters. Women outlive men, women outnumber men. Aging in America and ageism in America is a Me to moment. One of the reasons I chose this city is this city has been at the very forefront of perpetuating the false idea of beauty for decades, and their time has come to say, fuck you and fuck your beauty myth. Right on. And by the way, that's the first of many F-bombs I plan on dropping. But the reality is, again, when I came with board members like Jose Andreas, my beloved friend, and Eric Overhauser from Tender Greens, and a variety of other people who are doing bold, powerful work with food, I was told that the idea of a blended meal wouldn't work. The idea that food could not touch was paramount. And more importantly, protein equals meat, and meat is the center of the plate. And the reality is that was not my vision, and that is not the way we're going to be able to feed this many older people. But make no mistake, the barriers I met were not confined to the Department of Aging, because the reality is the same idea of separation and no touching permeates philanthropy in general. If I had $1 for every time I went to a foundation and said, I've looked at your interest areas, and of the 5 that you have, I do 3. How about a real significant investment in what we're doing? Because the future, not only with food, but also philanthropy, is blending. And the reality is, I was told, no, we don't do that. You must pick a silo. And the silo construct of philanthropy is a chokehold on our innovation. And the reality is, there are foundations throughout this city that I could not budge from that concept, that you could not only do 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 things at the same time, but we must. But that was not the only barrier I faced, brothers and sisters, because the real barrier I faced was political. And not unlike the plate or the silo, it was the dot that did in the LA kitchen. Because for too long, we have allowed this horrible construct that .com organizations drive the American economy, while .orgs do good deeds. And the reality is, no matter who I went to talk about the issues we faced and the barriers that we could overcome, if elected leaders understood the fact that as a social entrepreneur, I brought almost $5 million into this city from outside LA. In fact, thanks to Jan at the California Association of Nonprofits, we know that nonprofits in California bring over $40 billion a year out into California from outside. Yet, was there one politician in any city or any race that talked about the role of nonprofits and their vision for the future? I'll tell you, no. Because we are viewed as tillers in the field of America. We are servants in the house. We are not considered equal to business. And so when I'd go to talk to people, I'd meet an aide. I wouldn't meet the city council member. I'd meet their aide. And they'd tell me, as aides tell all of us, whether it's in Washington, D.C., Sacramento, or the city you live in, the point is, we meet aides. We rarely meet because we don't pay ourselves enough to make political contributions, and we don't represent, again, organized votes or money. And that limits us all to a tremendous degree. So that's what ultimately had me in a place where I had no choice 2 weeks ago but to announce, with great sadness, that after 30 years of making payroll, I've never missed a payroll in my life for 30 years. And for 30 years, every single day, I went to work and I fed people. I never led an organization that wasn't a 7-day-a-week operation. So for the first time in my life, 2 weeks ago, I didn't do that. And I have left the nonprofit sector. And many people, let's get this out of the way right now, man. A lot of people said, Robert, what are you going to do next? And the reality is, I've been very inspired by Colin Kaepernick and the symbolic nature of him taking a knee. So I've decided in my career, I'm going to take a knee. Because the reality is, I'm a white man in America. And everything I had, every grant I got, every interview I had, every opportunity I got was because I was born a white man in America. And one of the most important things that white men in America can do is, in effect, say, my time is past. I've had my run. I've been in the spotlight. There's a new generation coming. And the only way they're going to achieve that glorious opportunity is if they climb up on my shoulders or generational peers. And that idea of saying, in effect, my shoulders are now your shoulders. I will not lead another nonprofit organization, nor will I raise money. But I will give my heart and my soul and my imagination and every idea I have to anyone who comes asking, to the best of my ability, without a charge. I just want to help a younger generation because the ring is going to come around. My generation missed it. God bless us. We were the richest, freest, most educated generation in the history of the world. And we had one of the best soundtracks ever. But the reality is, for a million different reasons, we missed that ring, and it's going to come around again. And the reality is the younger generation, the only chance they're going to have if they get a boost up. And so I want to be able to offer my knee and my shoulders to that generation. But let's take it a little bit further, because the reality is, in this room, there are plenty of white men just like me who've been in charge for a long time. And the reality is, in many of our foundations, it's not just individuals, it's organizations too. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Washington, D.C. for one of these secret gatherings of hunga-munga nonprofits. And there were all kinds of organizations that had been around for 30, 40, 50 years. And the reality is, for all of their love and all of their work, they haven't been able to change the true dynamic of the need for charity. And let's be straight, charity is based on the redemption of the giver, not the liberation of the receiver. And the reality of trying to turn that around. So I look out right now and I see Black Lives Matter. I see the Million Woman March. I see the power of women running for office. I see a whole new generation of people and activists who are not going to sit by and allow the false barriers of a plate, a silo, or a dot stop them from achieving their generation's birthright. It is every generation's birthright to say with love and respect to the previous generation, man, that was your bag. That's not ours. We have our own new ideas. So while I want to offer any skills and knowledge I have to that generation, I would urge and ask that so many of the leaders in this room, both individually but also organizationally, stop and say, how can my organization, our organization, serve you? Not the other way around. Not come and work for us first as an intern and then as a staffer. And maybe in 50 years when I have to finally retire. And I would add that one of the great dilemmas in the nonprofit sector is not men and women who don't want to leave, it's men and women who cannot afford to leave. Our sector, because low administrative overhead has been the intellectual albatross on our collective necks, none of us can afford to retire because we don't have retirement plans. So what's important to do is for a generation of leaders and the organizations they lead to learn how to let go. It is not human nature, but it can be learned and it must be learned. So I would urge, in fact, if there was a new hashtag, it would be on my shoulders or I took a knee. And I wish every single foundation and every single foundation leader and every single organizational head or board chair that's been in that seat for more than 10 years really look in the mirror and say, is my opinion the most important one? Or can I play a very different kind of leadership role in America? And that's what I think needs to happen. But the third is political. And that's, if you won't mind me kind of looping this around, I want to go back to the 19th Amendment. Because, you know, for every single day of those decades between the Seneca Falls Convention and the 19th Amendment, women heard all kinds of reasons why they couldn't vote. Their integrity would be compromised. Their femininity would be compromised. The sacred value of the home would be compromised. They would only mirror and parrot the vote of their husband and other things that we can laugh at through the lens of history. But the reality is, for those years they spent trying to get the vote, they spent more time trying to convince women they had the vote, they had the right to vote, not men. Women had been told they couldn't vote for so long that they actually believed they shouldn't. And the reality is, I'd like to suggest that the nonprofit sector is in that same boat. But let's be real honest, because we're going to have, over the next year or two, the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And with love in my heart, I want to tell you that, for all intents and purposes, when the Seneca Falls Convention began, it was linked with abolition. And women of color, women like Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass were there. But the reality is, black women got thrown under the bus for the 19th Amendment, and they didn't get the right to vote. They were told they would, and they eventually were told, well, hey, man, this is the only way we're going to get it, and we'll pivot and come back for you. But they never did. And the reality is it took decades for African Americans to organize. Now, where do you think they organized? The only place they could, black churches. And they were nonprofit black churches. That was the only place African Americans could go and talk openly about a future they could only dream of. And it was in 1954 that the first major crack in segregation happened with Brown versus the Board of Education, brought by a nonprofit, the NAACP, all the way to the Supreme Court. But backing a church in Topeka, Kansas, an assistant minister who wanted to see his kid get the fair shake that they deserved as a child in America. And the reality is that Supreme Court decision put the first major crack in the idea of Plessy versus Ferguson, which for decades, the odious idea of separate but unequal held sway. And particularly in the South, it kept African Americans from their franchise of being able to vote. Now the reality is that was the goal of two groups of nonprofits, the NAACP and black churches throughout the South. Now we have been limited, and over the past few years you've heard a lot of talk about the Johnson Amendment, brought without hearing or testimony by Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson in 1954, a scant 40 days after Brown versus the Board of Education. I would suggest to you that the Johnson Amendment was about stifling the voting rights of African Americans for as long as they possibly could in the South. And the reality is, and you can pick, that's my personal opinion of the Johnson Amendment, but there's other origin stories. But the reality is, all of them are wrong. Since the first day it was put forth, we should have fought. And we should have said, without hearing or testimony, with zero evidence that nonprofits actively participating. In fact, in the Malibu fires, one of the most amazing things, a great synagogue birthed the Chicano rights movement on the hills of Malibu in 2 synagogue youth camps. The churches have always played a role in the labor movement, in abolition, and a variety of things. But that stopped in 1954. And ever since then, we have been led by people who tell us we must genuflect and respect the Johnson Amendment. I say no more. Now I'm a minority, but I urge you, if you leave with anything today, just ponder. Nonprofits in America. You know, when the Johnson Amendment was passed, there was only a handful, less than 50,000 nonprofits in America. But in the decades since, nonprofits which are led 7 out of 10 times by women, founded by and led by women. We are the feminized part of the American economy, which I believe has a tremendous amount to do with the role we have been denied playing in American politics. We are the 3rd biggest employer in America. You know, there are 14 million men and women who work at a nonprofit. We channel the energy of 70 million volunteers every year who are looking for a place, whether they're old and want to contribute in their later years or young because they've been raised doing service. We channel the energy and dynamism of so many Americans back into the community. But most importantly, if you take one phrase away from this small conversation we're having, it's that there are no profits without nonprofits. And I really want you to let that sink in, because that is economic fact. If you go to any town in America where you don't have churches, synagogues, mosques, arts and culture, if you don't have health care and education, clean air and clean water, you can't make money in a town without nonprofits. Yet for too long, we've accepted the role that all we are entitled to is the leftover money at the end of the year and no politics. Now, there are those who would say, oh, no, Robert, we must protect ourselves, just as men told women and other women told women during the suffrage march, your integrity. You'll lose your integrity. In fact, that is the phrase I've heard over and over in the past 5 years from the National Council of Nonprofits, the Council on Foundations, and hopefully no more from independent sector. The reality, we've been told, no, our integrity. What about dark money? Brothers and sisters, our sector was built on dark money. All the money we make is old white men's money given away by white men. The reality is we are up to our necks in dark money. You know, look at, I don't know how many of you all in my business, Tyson Chicken, one of the biggest contributors of food to the nonprofit sector that feeds hungry people. They just made a campaign contribution to Stephen King, the racist senator from Iowa. And we still take their chicken. Maybe we should be saying, fuck you and fuck your chicken. But the reality is we don't say that, because the reality is we're too afraid to say that. And we need to stop that right now. We need to own our power. We need to own our collective strength. We need to own the fact that America cannot thrive without us, and no economic plan for the future of America is viable unless our sector is not only in the mix, but at the table, not as lesser thans, but as equals to business, equal to government, and essential for any community's future. Now, the reality is I've had a good run. You know, as I said, I've been here many, many years, and I love everything about it. And I got to tell you, while I'm not going to be running a nonprofit, if anybody wants to get in touch with me, I put both my mission statement and my email address in the future up, and I think John's going to put it up now. Can you see? That's where you can reach me from now on. And I know it's funny, but I mean it. And I don't mean it in a belligerent way. I don't mean it in an angry way. I mean it in the same spirit that drove Harvey Milk. I mean it in the same spirit that drove Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, and any other liberator, Bruce Springsteen. You pick them. That's the spirit. It's a spirit of saying, when you got to change things because things aren't right. You can say it a million different ways. I've just chosen to say, I'm fucking shit up. But the reality is that's my future. I came to LA a couple of years ago, and I did a keynote out in Venice Beach. I must admit, of all the communities that accepted me, I was most honored to be welcomed by the community of Venice Beach again and again. And I introduced my vision for the LA Kitchen with a metaphor of the silver tsunami. And the reality is every single day in America, 10,000 people turn 70, and that's going to keep happening over and over, day after day, for the next 15 years. And there's no plan. And we've been made to think with the use of words like tsunami that that's something to dread. But the reality is I welcome it because I know there's a huge number of my generation that look in the mirror every single day and wonder, how did I get so lost? I had so much freedom, so much time, so much opportunity. How did I get so lost? Thinking if I just bought more stuff. And they come to us. And that idea of that wave, that metaphorical wave, is also buoyed by the almost 100 million people under 30 who've been raised doing service. One of the great social experiments in the history of the world. Virtually every single millennial has done service. So what we have is a wave, a cascading giant wave coming that I hope will also be swelled by the ranks of people from the nonprofit sector, the 14 million people, and particularly the younger people who come into this sector, saying with all due respect, the time for charity has passed. Now is the time for change. I said it then that there's a wave coming and I wanted to ride it with all my heart. And I still do. And I hope you'll join me. Cowabunga, motherfuckers.